Now, for the first case study, the question is, can we call the right-wing populist movements in Europe in recent times, can we call them totalitarian movement? It is hard to answer this question in absolute terms, but we can analyze some of the characteristics of a totalitarian movement in 20th century, early 20th century. We can analyze those conditions and relate those conditions to these that exist now, or the characteristics that exist now in right-wing populism, and see if these movements are totalitarian movements. Now, let's start with the atomized, self-isolated or isolated individual. In France, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and in some other countries of Europe, where we have seen the rise in right-wing populism. There are three important characteristics of these movements that indicate some similarities to the totalitarian movements of 20th century. First, these are inherently exclusive and exclusionary movements, homogeneous in their nature, claiming to purify the society from the ethnic, religious, ideological impurities that have caused some radical change in the social identities of their recipient societies. Second, these are inherently anti-globalization and anti-European Union movements. And in their anti-globalization, anti-European Union propaganda, these movements create a sense of victimhood, similar to the 20th century totalitarian movements, similar to those movements, a sense of injustice and individuals being the victims of that injustice. At the same time, these right-wing movements prescribe a solution which again is very nationalistic, exclusive, homogeneous, racist in some cases, to get to the normal conditions. Thirdly, these movements have a very genuine, and by genuine I mean something so much sophisticated that anyone with a careful observation can see this aspect. These movements have some very sophisticated anti-democratic tendencies, a contempt for democracy, but at the same time, their politics, or at least their narrative, they try to justify through democratic means. Again, the similar characteristic using democratic means in order to gain the power and then dissolving democracy itself. Now, it's premature to have a conclusion whether the right wing populism in Europe shares some or many characteristics with the totalitarian movement in 20th century. But having the conditions that I already told you in the past lecture in conditions for totalitarianism in 21st century, having those conditions first at place. Secondly, having the contempt, the sense of victimness, the creation of injustice, image of an injustice system, then conspiracies behind it, having a particular group that is actually causing all those troubles, then fighting against or arguing against the global international forces, creating objective enemy in the face of having an European Union against the institution like European Union or a phenomenon like globalization, creating an objective enemies. And within then that category, you might also find a particular community that is being played as the culprit of that phenomenon, which is causing unrest or which is causing victimhood to this particular community. And lastly, having contempt for democracy itself, a very fine, a very, by fine I mean something that is delicate, that is observable, but at the same time very deceptive as well, a contempt for democracy. These are some of the conditions that, in my view, and I might have a premature view, can be called as the totalitarian movements of 21st century. Of course, the cases vary from state to state, from society to society. Situations are pretty much different. Societal structures are very much different. Classes that we have are very much different. In 20th century, in 20th century totalitarian movements, what we saw Jews ending up as the main victim of those totalitarian movements, and um, perhaps the largest victim of that movement. In those movements, we saw a clear process of creating the other, creating the enemy, the objective enemy, and then punishing that enemy. Punishing that enemy for just because of their being, not because of anything of their doing, but because of their being. We see the same anger and contempt in some of these totalitarian movements, in some of these right-wing populist movements in Europe, the same contempt and anger against a particular community. Now, Hannah Arendt, she argued that Jews became the victim mainly because Europe moved to a classless society, and that classless society created, especially those who lost their jobs, who lost their prestige, who couldn't really preserve their social status or their political status, and in uh, out of anger, out of victimness, they were more vulnerable to believe in those conspiracies that were being propagated by the Nazi regime in Third Reich in Germany. They were more vulnerable to accept those conspiracies because of that classless society. And Jews were more vulnerable, basically, to fall victim of that propaganda. Because if you look at the first two parts of Hannah Arendt, her historical in the origins of totalitarianism in her book, if you look at the first two parts, what you will see that that the Jews, in result of imperialism, couldn't really assimilate, integrate into this new form of a society. It was kind of a classless society, and were more vulnerable to be looked upon as the outsiders. Similar phenomenon you can find in modern societies. And I will say again, I mean, there are a lot of differences, but at the same time, there are some what can be called overarching conditions that are similar in totalitarian regime of early 20th century and right-wing populism movements of early 21st century.